All right, good evening. This is working. Thank you for coming or returning or staying and remaining. I'm Ulrich Baer, as Valentin said. It's a great pleasure to have two distinguished writers, journalists, reporters with me on this panel tonight. I'm mediating partly the transatlantic dialogue here, one of the many limits of writing national borders, actually. So Colette Braeckman is going to talk about her work and Jon Lee Anderson about his work. And I will jump right in with a very basic first question and ask my two co-panelists whether we could help define what is the direct experience, the raw material with which you build your stories, of where you get them, what they are. Is it first-person accounts, interviews, facts, testimonies? What do you take as someone going into a situation as the raw material with which you then create your accounts? Maybe Colette, you want to start, then you'll jump in. I'll mediate and moderate as needed. Okay.
Well, as a reporter, I think that my experience is very simple. I'm trying, like my colleagues, to be at the right place at the right time and to send my story in time. So before any personal feelings, I try to reply to some practical constraints, to have a good story, to define what is a good story with a component of human interest, action, also a political sense, and a story that has a meaning for my readership. And then we used to say that a good story is a story that arrives in time, but it can be the best story in the world, but if you cannot send it and it cannot reach your paper or your audience, there is no way. So this is the personal thing. And then I used to say also that a personal experience is like a raw material that you choose to refine, to build. You build a story that is acceptable for your audience, but you are like a miner, a coal miner. You bring some pieces of reality, you bring them into the light, you carry them, and then you put it on the table, and that's it. Your job is, that was your job. After that, other people will come, historians, specialists, scientists, whatever, and they will use this raw material that you have tried to bring out of nothing, to bring it into the reality. For me, this is the personal experience.
Okay.
I think there's different types of reporters who cover war, report on war. There are the types who feel that they know their craft, and they go to a place with the kind of outlines of a story already in mind. And then there are the others, maybe a minority, who don't really know what they're going to write and follow their instinct. I think I find myself in the latter group. I assume that everything is chaos and that I will find the piece of string. And I exactly agree with you about what make up the components of the material, although I think you have greater clarity than I do about them. I always forget when I go, and I plunge in, and I've tried to find the kind of an epiphany or a moment that speaks to me, and from that moment or that person, try to gain an understanding, because I feel usually extremely confused and that I don't understand the whole. And I guess I'm reflecting what I need to do to distill as a writer in such a situation for my readers. I think it took me a long time to know what the raw material was. I know in the early part of my career, I was working for news magazines that wanted one thing, and I was only ever seeing another. And what I felt was important never got in to what I published. And now I feel that it's somehow paired up. Now that I've been working now for The New Yorker for a number of years, and I feel that, there I somehow have the scope and the space and the freedom of mind to find something that feels original, that is somehow going to be relevant, even in just a small way. I feel that we have a kind of burden of responsibility when you cover war, because it's not only about informing. You do want people, you do sort of want to move people's consciences in some way. Otherwise, what's the point of it? The daily reporters are all around, and what they've seen right next to you is tomorrow morning in the New York Times or Libération or whatever it is. And as someone working for a magazine that's going to come out perhaps in 10 days' time or a week's time or 2 weeks' time, you have to look beyond. You have to witness the present and look somehow just beyond it in that shadow area where hopefully something original lies, something with impact, something that will tell a larger truth, without getting too highfalutin about it either, you know.
Can I jump into this and ask to take your point and say there's a story dictated by the nature of the experience you encounter, something that captivates you. There's also a story you need to write, as you said, for your audience. So there's one demand to tell a story that will be published and be understandable to your readership. There's one story that you find and encounter that you want to turn into a story worth telling.
Yes, but my readership, even if in a daily newspaper, they don't want to read the story they can find in the other papers. Okay. Sometimes this is a discussion with with the newsroom, because they want to. Sometimes they tell to the journalist, before you go, what is your angle? You are going to speak about to describe this of this, and then I used to reply, if I know it in advance, why should I travel? I can write it from my desk. If I know everything, if I know the response before I take the plane, no way to move. So I prefer to go on the spot and then to be to have to look at the things free and independent, and I forget all what I could read before, all things they are telling me, asking me. I just forget about that, and I just try to find a genuine experience, because I think this is more interesting.
So tell us a little bit, what does it mean to find a genuine experience? Do you interview somebody? Do you listen in? Yes. Do you observe things? All of those things? You
go without ideas preconceived. You just go and open your eyes, and you will find something. There is a lot of. You must do what we say, your homework, to know the general frame and political background and so and so. And then when you arrive, you must forget you forget that. You open your eyes, and that's it, and you will find out.
I mean, it may help if we tell some stories. I was just thinking as you were speaking, Colette, and you were asking about Libya in the revolution in 2011. At the very beginning, I went there in the early days, and what I found was absolute chaos. And by very young people who really didn't know what they were doing, but they were acting out a kind of spectacle, almost a performance of war and liberation, without actually having fought one yet. Gaddafi had not yet attacked them. They were going around shooting in the air. And then after some days, and I found this amorphous spectacle difficult to define, other than to say what I just said. You know, there were details within it. And then I had been in Benghazi about a week. And so, again, I had gone there to cover the Libyan revolution. But what was that? What was within it? What was it? And after about a week, there were reports that some Gaddafi forces had come and attacked a town nearby. And I went there with some other people, and sure enough, there was a battle going on. And so I saw these students that thought they had done a kind of Tahrir Square revolution, having to respond as fighters to experienced fighters. And then began this incredible story of the zigzag war, the back and forth war on the road. Every day they would charge forward until they reached Gaddafi's troops, who would gun them down, and they would run away in terror. And then they would find their bravery again and come back. And it would happen 10 times once in one day, this kind of thing. And it went on for weeks. And but even that was difficult to define. And meanwhile, it was coming out in photographs, This was the first war in which photographers went with their iPhones. And so there were tons of young 20-somethings who had been, I don't know, studying Arabic in Egypt and decided to come. And now there they were. And in some cases getting shot, getting abducted, lots of bad things happening. But I just knew that I hadn't found my piece of string, my story yet. And one day I stumbled onto it. Near the front line, I found a man whose son was at the front, and he didn't know how he was. And they were both volunteers. The father, my age, as an ambulance driver. The son, his son, whom he had encouraged to join. They were Libyan Americans, but they'd come back from America to do this. And he saw me as a kindred soul, and I remember he hugged me and wept and clung to me as one father to another, telling me his terror on behalf of his son, that his son might die, while expressing his admiration for his son's courage. It was incredibly dramatic, and I thought no more about it until, other than the experience itself, I noted it as a vignette. And I then went to the front and had to run back again, and the usual thing. And the next day I found him, and his son had been killed. And from that moment on, this man's and his story, the story of Osama, this man, and his son, Mohammed, who was being killed within probably an hour of the time he clung to me like that, became a very intimate relationship to what was actually happening within it. And I always have an ear cocked to the far horizon now. I don't think I did before. I was like, what will get through to people in America? What will get through to them? What kind of story makes them no longer see this as just a mass of Arab people or Libyans or whatever it is, and actually feel this place? And, I hoped that it would be the story of this man and his son. And that's what I ended up writing. Did the story find you? Did you find the story? I don't know. But for instance, that's how I chose to tell, I suppose, idiosyncratically, the story of that particular time, that particular sort of part of the Libyan tragedy, which is what it was, and still is. And and I hoped through that story to sort of touch any father and remind people about what war really is, too. It's about, loss and fear and all of those things, rather than a story necessarily of courage, which is also true. It's interesting, though. I think there are those of us who seek stories of courage, and there are those of us who seek stories of suffering, and there are those of us who seek, I don't know, other things. Maybe we reflect our own experience. Yeah, our own character.
What you're introducing, I think, is it's what in this story is relatable. It's probably not entirely clear whether it has to be a father who reads it, whether it's to be somebody who had a father or has a father, what part of that story resonates with people. It's probably not totally known to you, whoever read that story in America, what they related to, what dimension of this, when you're saying it's not clear, it's not about courage, about loss.
Well, it's about all those things. I knew when I wrote this story, it was very painful even to write, because I also felt his loss. I went through it with him. And it became a very emotional experience for me, because I had a very personal connection to this person who'd felt this loss. And when I wrote it, I felt the loss. And I remember, it isn't always this way, but I wanted to transfer this feeling of loss to the reader. And I really wanted them to feel some of what I felt and that Osama had felt. and I did have, considerable responses from people who'd read it, who said that they'd wept and this kind of thing. And when they said that, this isn't very normal, this isn't very usual, I felt good. Because the hardest thing, I think, for anybody who writes about conflict or goes there is getting people who live in a faraway place to actually feel it, It's very easy for it to become white noise
If we stay with a sense of responsibility for a moment, that you have a responsibility toward this person whose story you just witnessed, and to get it then published, there's a sense in which you were able to create an audience and actually share the story. But there must be many times when you receive such a story and you have it, but you cannot publish it, or your platform doesn't need the story right now, or you didn't get it in time, or they don't want this, they want something else. So you still have a sense of responsibility, which is a way to try to bear witness to that story, but the journalism outlet doesn't allow for that necessarily. So you both must be filled with stories that you couldn't turn into publishable material.
Yes, or people that you just drop. People, they tell you a terrible story, and then you are there, and you sometimes, in the best case, you write it, you share your emotions, and so, but after that, you cannot adopt the child, you cannot make the follow-up of the family, and so, you see, once I was in Kivu, and I met a boy, he was a former child soldier, and then we went into sympathy, we had a good relation, and he told me his whole story, that he was just after the commandant. He was the one who killed the people, so the commandant told him just in a snap, you do that, and he could understand the orders of this commander, Afandi, as they say, and he took the people in the forest and he just killed them. And he explained that he was 16 years old when I met him. So he was so young and he had killed so many people. He explained that to me, and then he wanted to be a carpenter, and he did not want to go back to his village because he said, I'm ashamed, I cannot meet my parents anymore, I don't know where they are, and even if I meet my father and mother, I am so ashamed of what I did. So I wrote the story of this boy, but I feel sorry myself and guilty because I did not make the follow-up. I could have, I don't know, looked after him or sent him money and to help, but I have no time and I did not do it. And until now, I said, shit, I missed something. I should have myself be a better human being if I could have done something to help him.
I think we all carry, I mean, one thing that this profession doesn't prepare you for is the moment of truth. It's not in any manual. What do you do when suddenly you have the person in front of you who needs your help, not the journalist filling his or her notebook or taking the picture? We've all had moments like that, and not everybody responds well. A photographer, I remember, friend of mine once told me, he said, after we'd had a particularly grueling experience and he'd been watching me when he wasn't behind the camera, and he said, you writers have it easier. I'm sorry, he said, we photographers have it easier because we're behind the lens and something happens. And it's true, I've seen it so many times. We're left with the actual truth of what's there, and they somehow have it's refracted through this lens. And there's a moment of, sometimes they don't realize till later what they've actually seen.
I mean, but just to put a footnote, this is not the panel, but there is a large discussion about the responsibility of photographers, and we have actually harrowing examples of photographers who've taken shocking images that went around the world of a starving child, and then the photographer actually committing suicide 18 months later because the world has turned against him and said, how could you photograph instead of intervening? How could you lift your camera instead of lifting your hand and helping this child? And I think there may be photographers who feel there's a distancing with the camera, but there are also probably people who feel the same sense of, I should have helped as a human being, not as a professional.
No, absolutely.
So you have these stories.
I have also experiences like Colette, in which you do, at a certain point, I said to myself, if the choice comes between being Jon Lee, the journalist here, with my supposed impartiality, and Jon Lee, the human being, I take the latter, even if it means intervening, and no problem. I have no problem with it whatsoever. I intervene right and left if I can actually alter someone's lives for the positive, but I do write about it, if so. So people can judge me. But it takes a while to learn that, though. Yeah.
Can I ask you, sort of, when someone tells you a story, such as the one you just recounted, why do they tell you their story, aside from the fact that you are a journalist, presumably not from that place? Do they also want, to have their story told in a newspaper abroad? Do they know what effect that could have? Secondly, do they want to talk to you as a human being, or do they also just want to tell their story to someone? Because if this young man doesn't go back to his family, to his parents, he says there is so much shame around actually what he's done, that who is he going to talk to?
I don't know. I think it was this sort of confidence building. We were together and he felt, I don't know, confidence that he wanted to explain to somebody, and I was just there to listen to him, and I think he was happy, I don't know, but he wanted to share his questions and his experience. And sometimes in Rwanda, it happens to me, the survivors, they did not speak to their neighbors. They did not speak with the common people in Rwanda of what they went through, the survivors. And sometimes some women said, okay, let's sit, and they started slowly, and suddenly it's like opening something. The whole story came. It was not to be published. It was just to share the experience, to have somebody to spend some hours with and to talk to. That was it.
I think because we are an exceptional apparition in a panorama of war, of destruction, in which, in whatever way, it's all about killing. It's all about killing. A society kills one another, it kills itself, and you are not part of that. You come in, and we are an exception. So I've found over the years that perpetrators, in some cases, not necessarily these sort of very, these brutalized young kids who've been forced to be killers, but sometimes the ones who've ordered them, they also like to tell what they do in some way. Yes. And the reporter can become a kind of father confessor figure, or maybe the dynamic between man and woman is also pertains. I'm thinking now about the last time I was in Iraq, which was several years ago. The person I trusted the most in Iraqi, who I had worked with for 4 years, who I trusted with my life, and was everything to me, my man Friday, my driver, my bodyguard, my friend, my confidant, confessed to me that he was now involved in the sectarian war and was involved in killing people himself, torturing and killing them. And he wanted me to know it. And I told him, and I sat in judgment of him, and I challenged him, and I argued with him. And I told him that I would write about it, and he agreed. I protected his identity. And I talked with his co-conspirators, and they all, told exactly what they were doing and how they were doing it. And it was gruesome. And it altered our relationship. It somehow didn't change the fact that we were friends, curiously enough. I still sit in judgment of what he did, but he remains somehow a friend. He is a friend. You can't take away the before. And I place what he did in a very specific time and place in his culture. But it's complicated. And I did write about it. Therefore, at some level, I feel that he wanted me to judge him. He wanted to know where he was in the moral universe. And I judged him pretty harshly.
So if I take those two examples, you said and emphasized you wrote about him, and you sit in judgment, and you said sometimes people told you a story and this was not meant to be published. This was actually after some hesitation.
No, they don't ask if it will be published or not.
Yeah. Interesting.
They just tell it for telling it.
For telling it.
Because I am a foreigner, I am somebody from abroad, I will not judge them. I'm just listening.
Yeah.
That's it. And they don't ask, are you going to write and to hide my identity, whatever. After that, other people came. Sometimes people from the institution, people who take care of them, and they come and say, please don't write, please don't give the name. And they give me orders how to do so and so and so. But the person itself, no, they just want to be listened to. And it doesn't come if they are going to write or not write. That's not the point. Other people come after that to control because they want to control the situation.
And can we stay for a moment with the original hesitation? So it's very different for somebody who tells you something that they haven't talked about versus somebody who wants to tell you something that he may feel he's guilty in some sense. If you're saying introducing a larger moral universe, a larger frame, you're talking about the experience of a survivor, I assume, who actually shares their...
A victim.
A victim.
Yeah.
So we have actually two perspectives, and I, for the moment, if we've stayed, so you let them tell their story. You may actually ask them questions to understand it in a different way. We talked about this before the panel a bit, how you may hesitate less to say, I'm going to ask you a couple more very difficult questions, and you may say, I'm going to allow you to shape the story and give you that space. So when we talk about the limits of the original material, there may be very different limits depending on what your own position coming in. And your position is probably not entirely neutral. It's not the outside moral universe that's universal. It's the knowledge you have about the situation, right? You come in with a framework that you've tried to be as diligent as you could about establishing. But it's not a neutral moral law that it comes in from the outside.
The last times, I worked a lot with women in the Congo who've gone through sexual violence. But then I try to respect them. If they want to speak, I'm there. If they don't want, that's okay also. Just if they want somebody to listen.
And can you say, you wrote a book that just came out about somebody who works with
Yes.
these groups of women. Can you say
Yes.
something about this?
And precisely, it was. I think it was difficult to leave to listen only to the woman, to give the experience of, to make the story go through. That was discussed yesterday. And so I choose the doctor, Dr. Mukwege, who is a doctor with, I call him repairing the woman, is making the surgery, and he's an extraordinary doctor working in Bukavu. And I think he was the mediator between the horrible story of this region, the terrible stories of the woman, what he's trying to do, and he's a sort of charismatic person. And so I tried to retrace his story because he accepted to speak with me for several weeks. We spent a long time together. And so this book was, thanks to him, as the central element of the story. It took me through the whole story of the war in Congo, the first war, the second, the rebellion, and so, because he's the one, he was guiding the reader into this.
But you said there's kind of medical assistance and actual physical restoration, but he also allowed them to tell their story once.
Yes.
You said that.
Yes,
and that was an important function, which
yes,
we'll get back to you about the other side.
He has a clinic in Bukavu, and he created, and this is rather new, but it makes me thinking, he forbids the journalists to spend too much time with women and to repeat their story. And he has created what he calls a one-stop center. That means a woman, it has been gone through sexual violence, tortured, and so, when she reaches the hospital, she has to tell her story only once, and it is on record. And then this version is the first one, absolutely fresh and complete. It is for the doctor, for the psychologist, for somebody who is giving her economic support, and so. But it is only once, because he says if she has to repeat it, the trauma will comes back. So it's better to make the story told only once. But the thing is that in Kivu you have a lot of women. They never told the story. They tell sometimes the story for the first time to a journalist who is just there, who happens to be there, and they're happy to tell it maybe only once, but it can be a relief for them. But you have to assess that, if it's a relief or if it's a pain. And if it's a pain, please, you have to abstain.
I mean, so this is
If it's a pain?
to abstain from asking too many times.
Oh yes,
because there's
painful for them.
reliving
painful.
the
Yes.
If
trauma.
they have to repeat and to go through this
relive
painful
this.
experience
Sure, no, I understand,
again,
yeah.
I think that you are not, en français, a voyeur.
Yeah, voyeur,
A voyeur.
absolutely.
You must respect also the decency.
This is very interesting
Yeah.
in a discussion about journalism, because there's a legal category where actually, for example, in the US, there are rape shield laws where victims of sexual violence do not have to testify in some cases when the perpetrator is in the room. And this is in direct response to post-Second World War testimonies where people had to stand and testify and the perpetrators were standing there facing them and said, this is actually unbearable. So they develop certain kind of restrictions in how the law can proceed to establish the truth. Then there's a kind of therapeutic assumption in largely, dominantly, probably US and European culture that telling one story is cathartic. That actually it's good to tell your story to somebody who's trained to receive it. You're trained you're not therapists, you're journalists, you're not a jury or a judge. So so it's not the legal dimension, not the therapeutic dimension, but you're still receiving the story. And then I think I would like to see where the difference lies between helping victims of violence versus establishing the truth of a perpetrator who comes to you and says, I would like to talk to you about what I am doing or have done. And it's the same with the young man who was a boy soldier. So whether we can see there's a difference between taking the raw material of the experience of a testimony of a perpetrator versus a testimony of a survivor.
But I am not a judge, I am just a human being.
Yeah.
I am a human being and I try to be empathic because this is the precondition for doing this kind of job. If you are not pre-empathic, please do something else. So you must be that, but I'm not a judge, I'm not a lawyer, not a doctor. And in Rwanda, for instance, I raised this question to me when I was in the middle of the genocide, and I said, what can I do? I am not a doctor. I should be a doctor to help those people. I should be a social worker to raise money and to help those people. I am nothing of that. What can I do? I can do nothing except writing. Except writing. There's a problem.
What?
And that was it.
I don't know, I didn't hear.
No,
Sorry.
no. And so,
Go ahead.
and this is it.
We've established not a judge, not a therapist, not a doctor, not a social worker, but some other function that's important as a journalist. Empathic is important.
I think, I do think I'm often asked by very young journalists who think that, war reporting is glamorous and, of course there's a whole heroicization that's gone on in movies and, there's a kind of, and literature, and there's a kind of idea that it's romantic and glamorous and so forth. And, I try to, nobody's going to stop somebody who has this urge. Few actually act on it, but as you know, they do, some do, and some are not prepared for what happens. So you try to prepare them with stories. But what I tell them, I find myself telling very young journalists is that, or people who want to be a journalist, and there'll always be the girl or the boy who says, I want to be a war reporter, like you, or something like that. Says, I'm not a war reporter. I'm a reporter who goes to war, and sometimes, and you have an ethical burden, you have a moral burden when you go to war. It's not like going and covering sports, or art, or music. It doesn't have it's not that I'm not applying a greater value to it, but because you're dealing with life and death, you do have a greater responsibility. And so, going back to what you were alluding to, the perpetrators, when I agree with you, but when I'm sitting with someone I know is a victimizer, someone who's calling the shots in a war, I'll be as empathetic as necessary, but I will drag out of them everything I can of their truth. Because that's the thing that's hardest to know, especially when a war is happening. The Mladiches of this world don't spill the beans while they're doing it. We always know what they've done years later, after the bodies are in the ground. But if you have a chance to get them to at least reveal their psychology, the way they think about others, then you know, as a reader, or it can be a filmmaker, it can be a radio journalist, you know what you're hearing when you hear it, or when you see it, or when you see it on the page. You know what those words mean. And they mean that they've objectified one whole section of humanity, and they're actively killing them. And if you can drag that out of all of the fog of war and all of the obfuscation and all of the reporting that inevitably frames the daily events, and you can somehow find the people that are making all of this happen. It doesn't happen that often. It's a kind of holy grail, but I think it's a kind of moral imperative if you have them in front of you. So, you know, the few times it's happened to me, you know, I definitely feel that it's a duty, it's a responsibility. You know, we have to learn again and again and again how this can happen, because it does. It always happens again, sometimes in large scale, sometimes in small scale, but it happens again and again and again. And we always seem to miss the magic moment at which it could have been stopped. Or we could have intervened if only we'd seen the signs. The signs are always there. That we're just not looking at them and we're not paying attention to them. So anyway,
Can I
that's my little soapbox.
stay with this question here for a moment? When you're listening to somebody, maybe it's obvious to you since you're journalists, but I'm not. When do you know that someone is actually telling you something and trying to take you into their story and telling you something that is probably not entirely true, trying to manipulate you in some way, for whatever reason they want to manipulate you, because you have to then listen to other people. Somebody says, this is what happened here, I'm going to bear witness to this event, this is all what happened. There is going to be another story, otherwise there would be no need to report. If everything we knew is they're guilty, they're innocent, this is all terrible because one side is in the right, one side is in the wrong. A lot of situations, we're trying to tease apart actually who's doing what. So there must be moments when people are telling you their side of the story by definition or by design to really manipulate you, or because that's all they can see at that moment because their world is organized in that way. Is that a matter of trusting yourself or to just check this narrative against many others?
I don't know. It's a question of feeling. It's not an exact science.
That's right.
It's just a boussole.
But it must become more urgent when somebody is telling you a very, very poignant, upsetting, narrative of trauma, where it's a little more difficult to say, this doesn't seem right. Was it really that day to go in? Because in my experience with testimonies, the question is you don't sort of push somebody at that moment and say, that doesn't make sense. It couldn't have been that day. Actually, you must have been in another town.
I repeat, I am not a policeman. I am not an investigator, a police investigator who say, oh, this day, I'm sure you were not there at that time because according to my knowledge, your group was not there. No, I am not I just live his truth, what he believes. I'm not an investigator.
And then what is your responsibility from taking this story and turning that into something that we in this room will read?
I'm still free to, I can listen, but I'm free to write or not. If I don't believe, I'm not obliged to write it. You see, it's not, if it's not totally reliable, well, I leave it. We'll see.
And when you're dealing with extreme experience, is that more difficult? The reliability aspect, that memories maybe not as reliable, certain things will be left out by definition, certain things won't be talked about.
Yes, but in some difficult moments, there are also the things that I can see with my own eyes. There are the things that people tell you, okay, but you can also look around and see what you can see, and I am not an investigator or a specialist, but I can see if there are bombings. I can see where the bombs are. Where the bomb was just in a neighborhood with a lot of people, where a lot of people were living. I can see that. And then when the other parts say, "Oh no, we just bombed military positions," and so no, I've been there. I've seen houses destroyed, people dying, and I can report on this. You see, it's not only what people tell you, there are also a lot of things
what
that
you
you see with your own eyes. When I was in Kisangani, that was 10 years ago, when two armies, Rwanda and Uganda, were fighting each other, but all the bombs were falling on the civilian population in Kisangani. I did not need people to tell me anything. I just could go out and see with my own eyes who were the victims and describe this. That was the truth, because I was there and I could report on this.
The reliability of, let me say, the reliability of a perpetrator story.
While you were talking, I was thinking about Charles Taylor, the former dictator former warlord and then president of Liberia for a number of years. He's now doing 50 years in The Hague, justifiably.
Playing tennis.
May he long rot there. But I went there to interview him and to profile him after he'd installed himself as president. And a lot of things were said about him at the time, most of it rumor. Nothing was said in public because everybody was absolutely terrified of him. For instance, and I reported some of the rumors because it seemed to me, in a place where, of course, no public discourse can exist because of the consequences are so dire, the rumor mill actually is something that's potent and valid. And it was important to, and so, for instance, there was a rumor, widespread, that he bathed in a bucket of fresh human blood every day. Now, this sounded very lurid. It sounded a bit like, oh, Emperor Bokassa, but it was coming from the population, not from outside. And I kept hearing this rumor. And, you know, to be in a country where the people, the citizens actually believe this of their president, you realize that you're in a different place. I happened to be in a car with the Archbishop of the country a few days after I was there. And while we were in the car, I leaned over and I said, Archbishop, this rumor about, he said, you mean about the blood? And I said, yes. I said, do you believe it? He said, oh, yes. Even the Archbishop of the country believed it. So when I eventually went to see Charles Taylor, I asked him about the rumor of the blood. I should just describe the scene. On the way into the palace, there were soldiers who were excavating under the tomb of the unknown soldier. The night before, they had blown it up. It was to see whether there were a human sacrifice from his predecessor there. Right. On the way into the palace, there was a parkland of trees, and I could see soldiers felling these beautiful trees, 60, 70-foot tall trees. And I asked my companions why they were felling the trees, and they said, because there was an owl there. And owls, of course, are humans, witches. We went into the palace. It was all dark. The soldiers inside were drunk. It was 10 in the morning. It was really scary. I had heard that diplomats going to see him had actually been mugged. One female ambassador had actually been nearly raped in the palace on the way to see him. Nothing happened to me. I came to see Taylor. He was sitting in a throne chair with a couple of, they could only be described as bimbos, sitting next to him, and some cowering bureaucrats in front. And he was wearing very expensive clothes, and he had a staff, a wooden staff, that was carved. And this was the first of several interviews I had with him over a couple of weeks. And I said to him, I brought up the human blood thing, and he laughed. He said, oh, my dear, people say such silly things. Ha ha, like this. He didn't deny it outright. He just laughed it. Eventually, trying to make conversation, I asked him about the stick. I said, I notice you carry that everywhere, Mr. President. He said, yes, and he named a tree. He said, it's from the Machigenga tree, something like this. And I said, well, man, what's the significance of this tree? He said, it's a magic tree. I said, why is it magic? How is it magic? He said, I've carried it since the war he began, of course. And he said, because all living creatures that walk under the branches of this tree, human or animal, die. And he just stared at me as he said it. And so I just was able to tell the story of what this president told me. And there was the rumors on the one hand, what I could see, what people had told me they had witnessed, what he did, and then with my access to him, merely transfer what he had to say, which was throughout a kind of, almost a kind of psychopathic, teasing allusion to what he was doing. Sometimes you don't have to work very hard
to get a story.
And even now, I couldn't say I know his ultimate truth, but I do know he did a lot of bad things. And even he didn't deny it at the time, or try to very hard anyway.
Can I ask you something very concrete about 2014? Your reporters, there's so many stories everywhere, and there are many more stories than there used to be. And I remember sitting on a similar panel with Susan Meiselas and Gilles Perez, who said they would work years and years and years, literally years, to get one photograph in an event organized by Ren Weschler, to get their photograph above the fold of the New York Times in that real estate, which was prime real estate for war photography. That's where you wanted to have your picture published, on the cover of the Times, above the fold, because supposedly someone in power would see it. Now, there are many places. So the New Yorker is a prestigious place. I think it's good that we have a democratization of the media, that there are other news outlets also in addition to the New Yorker and the New York Times. But what does it present for you as a challenge? Do the stories have to be more vivid, shorter, faster? There are many more versions of them. Has it changed your practice at all? Has it sped up? Is there a different way of people consuming? Most of us read our stories on the phone probably today. Does that change your work at all?
Well, not really, because what impressed me is that you can have many pictures and many stories, but always on the same situation, on the same country. But now, in this year, this time, you have more white spaces on the map than you had 20 years ago. Who can tell me here and everywhere what happens in South Sudan, in remote places in South Sudan today? What happens in Central Republic Centrafricaine, Central Africa? You have plenty of journalists in Bangui and around. What happens on the border of Chad? And so it's a wide space. No, there is nobody there. Nobody has the money, the means, the interest, the paper, whatever. But I don't know. And so there are several places like this who are interesting. And nobody's going. And I remember that 30 years from now, it's a long time, I could go in Eritrea, for instance, for my newspaper, and they allowed me to spend 3 weeks in Eritrea, and there was no internet, thanks God, there was no internet, no connection, and I was for 3 weeks around in Eritrea, visiting very remote places in Eritrea, their hidden caves and things like that, and I could report on that, and they allowed me 3 weeks without notice. Today, that's impossible. They allow you maybe 3 days, it's a luxury, 3 hours, it's a maximum. You see, but because of that, nobody will go deep in South Sudan, deep in Eritrea again to see what happens there.
But I would say what hasn't disappeared is the actual demand of politicians, for example, to respond very quickly, to make decisions, pass resolutions, actually take action. So it used to be that you tried to work for that story to change something, and you said much earlier, what can I do? So one of the purposes, I assume, of your work is to actually change something. It's not just to tell a story for the sake of telling a story, but to change something, to bring a certain level of awareness.
Not to change.
To not change.
Well,
I mean,
if people use my story to take action, that's good.
Right. But you're saying
it's up to them. That is their job. they are politicians. I'm not.
But Colette, don't you think that I certainly am. Aren't you increasingly aware of what we do being exploited by more and more? It always has been. The information you or I might bring out of a war zone can be used, of course, by any side. But more than ever, what we produce is the stuff of the war itself. I mean, increasingly, and it's not a cliche, the media is a big component of the wars of today. The wars of terror, certainly. It's almost all waged through via YouTube now. in what they themselves, the perpetrators themselves, film what they do and show us, shock us, horrified. It is actually a function of war. It's terrifying your enemy. It's terrorizing your enemy. It's saying, these are the consequences. This is how bad I can be. This is what I'm doing to you people. And then that's had an effect on the global battlefield. Not only the wars of terror, but the ones that you're discussing too. I think there's this idea that I think we have to be aware that whatever we report, if we work for responsible publications and have some kind of reputation, that they can, that politicians will try to use what we say for their own ends.
But that's,
Yes.
this development is interesting, that actually the parties waging war are now participating in journalism in a way you're saying. They're actually distributing images, they're feeding them to news outlets, they will be redistributed. So, and that maybe is a shift which allows some people to tell their story, which is a good thing, and you're saying it also allows some people to manipulate
It's always
others or terrify them.
any of us who went in with a rebel group 30 years ago. You go in, they want to show their side, they hope that by the time you've left after 3 weeks with the EPLF or whatever it is in Eritrea, that you are going to go out and do a violin concerto for them. They hope that.
They hope that.
They hope that. And of course, you don't produce the violin concerto, you produce whatever you produce.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're really unhappy and they condemn you to death or whatever it is they want to do. Now it's different. It's different. There are flaks. It used to be just government had flaks, PR people, these spin masters, these managers of information and image. But now you have, you can go to the most remote part of the world and there's rebel commanders with a sat phone, Skyping, tweeting, whatever, and fairly urbane propagandists.
And is there any hope or potential that in some of the white areas of the map, someone can actually use this and say, we can actually communicate what's happening here without having to rely on the non-existing Western sources anymore who won't pay for flying somebody down there or over there or up there, and say, we can actually use the technology to tell our side.
Well, that's what they're
That
doing.
actually not only perpetrators, but also people are being victimized, saying, we can actually document this right now.
Well, yes, but
Which
Yeah.
has been a trope in general, that people weren't aware, people didn't know, people couldn't see, and you're saying you can just see, but now you can see certain things from both sides.
you can see, but there is also a challenge. You get some sources. You cannot go there because your paper doesn't pay, doesn't
Yeah.
allow you. Okay,
Yeah.
you have other sources, but you must be very cautious, including the NGO sources. They go. You have now a lot of NGOs with good intentions or whatever, and they produce reports. And you have a bunch of reports on those white spots. I will not name them, but well, human rights organizations, pressure groups, and so and so. And they publish reports, and you don't have any other information. What is their credibility? They have the means to go there when I cannot go. Okay, I'm ready to say in good faith, they are reliable, but who is paying them? Why? What is behind them? Sometimes, okay, I rely that Amnesty is excellent and so, but I'm sure, if I am not sure of all of them, and sometimes they can be working for other interests. How can I know that? You see, so I have to work on the sources.
Yeah.
For me, it's a new problem.
I think we should open it up because we have modern media, so if anybody wants to ask a question, feel free to express yourself. I can't really see. Otherwise, I would have another question for you, but there's a question right there, so thank you. Go ahead.
Hello. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us. I would like to know, how do you protect yourself? You were saying you're not a therapist, you're not a doctor, still you're going to war sites. So how do you protect yourself? I mean, experiencing all these bad or cruel things. Do you go to a therapist, or what kind of, no, I don't mean as a joke, so what kind of help you're seeking for yourself in order to be able to go again in a new war and to report again.
Okay, thank you.
Well, what I know is that when I went back from Rwanda, I know that some of my colleagues, they went to a therapist. They really need it. And I was thinking myself, as I said before, what can I do? I can do nothing except writing. So I expressed the whole story in a book very quickly. And this summer, I did not take any holidays or day off or whatever. I just say I have to write, to write all what I know to express it. And when the book was finally released, well, I was still sad, but I felt better. And so I did not go to a therapist. But sometimes I know that for the moment, some journalists they have to protect and to tell, and there are some services within the connected with the newsroom. They can ask for support.
Mm-hmm.
But,
it's your one-stop shop, like the doctor. That sounded very good. Yeah. Not therapy, no. Decompression in neutral places.
And good friends to listen.
Exactly.
I need good friends that are there listening to my stories, and so I can make them laugh or cry or whatever. Good friends with whom I can share, and that's it.
So you don't keep the stories to yourself. You write them, you communicate them, you share them with others to communicate, to speak.
Yeah, I think some people do bottle things up and do get traumatized by it. And I think, like you, I speak it out. I write it, and if there's anything left, I speak it. And sometimes it's painful to relay. And that's just the way they are. There are things you carry with you that are always going to be painful. And that's the way it should be. There's no way to make it better. And I just assumed that as part of life. It's the price you pay. And fair enough. So, I know this bullfighter, and someone recently sent me a map, a diagram of his body with all of the places he'd been gored since, I think, 2000. It's almost every part of his body has received a horn. And, I think he would probably say the same thing, that that's what he gets for going in the ring with a bull. And he's not traumatized by it. So it's the same kind of thing. The people who really need therapy are the real victims. We're just there as observers, and it's sort of, fair enough. It's voluntary.
I think it's an important distinction, actually, and not to use the word trauma interchangeably as observing someone's suffering versus having lived through it. It's not the same category, possibly. So it's something else, maybe. Still may need therapy in some cases. But can we? Do we have another question? I wanted to ask one more thing, which is about peace. And people I know who have been war photographers actually have said they do a lot of work teaching in communities or countries where there's been war. And they say it's immediately understood when they said we have to teach people how to photograph peace. That is not understood in some places where there has been peace for a long time. But they said if there's been war, people understand immediately what that means, what would be documented. They don't even need to teach it. It's an obvious thing that this is an important thing. But this doesn't happen in communities where there hasn't been war in some palpable way in a long time. And I do think it is important when you said you have your frames and your short pieces and you have 3,000 words or whatever you have, or 500 words. There's very little room, and there is a tendency to then think this is the more real part of life. The trauma is the more real reality, the more authentic version. This is really what matters, whereas it's actually maybe not what really matters. It maybe is the thing that traumatized somebody but doesn't define somebody, a community, a person. So that peace reporting is something that's not just frivolous, nice little human interest stories, but it's actually an important dimension of also restoring a community or capturing what happened beforehand. And I wonder whether you see it another responsibility. Would you go back and say, do you go back 20 years later? Say, let me talk about what's here today. What is this
But
community
in
like today?
Rwanda, for instance, after that's 20 years now, but after I went almost every year in Rwanda, and I tried to see how people live together, and to see some communities, some people, sometimes psychotherapists to explain what they're doing, and so, well, it's not so spectacular as war, but it's important also to explain that. In Burundi, the story of a radio station, for instance, Radio Ijambo, that make people laugh of themselves. They were publicizing jokes about ethnicity and jokes among neighbors and cliché and so, and that helped the people to take a distance from themselves, from what they've been fighting for, and so. And the story of this radio, I think it's a very good story also.
Does it get published?
Yes, it's
Good.
yeah,
Okay.
it's a,
So there's
it's a
interest
good
in that.
story.
You want to say something about
No,
that?
no, that's, I think I haven't been back to that many places yet where I was during war. In most places, there isn't this kind of positive outcome, the ones I've been to anyway. I don't know if you can label or create a category for peace reporting. It sounds a bit deterministic. There is an Institute for War and Peace Reporting. It's an NGO, but as to my knowledge, they mostly do war reporting in places where at war. But with the objective of creating, of adding to civil society, to enhancing it, of course, that there is a function there, but it is a deterministic function. I don't know what to say exactly about that. I'm very aware that when I go home, I live in a very small town, that I'm in a place where nobody has been at war for a very long time. And I know that that is the norm, that is the reality. It's not the traumatized places I so often go away to. And for me, it's wonderful to be there, where the local newspaper, and last week there was a story, I loved this story. It was about a 500-year-old, sad event. A 500-year-old tree from the time of Elizabeth I was knocked over in the storms. And so it was a sad local story, and they talked about everybody who knew this tree. And it was a kind of mourning the passing of a tree in a little town with no more than 10,000 people. And there's the stories about this man's daughter and that woman's son who won the volleyball championship, or who, they've raised enough money for the lifeboat and things like that. That's normal life, and I know that that's normal life. So I live in normal life, but I don't report on it yet. I wouldn't know how to, I don't
We
think.
used to say, no news, good news,
Right.
no news.
I want to thank the two of you also, actually, with truly, I have a lot of respect for what you do. Not every boy and girl dreams of being a war reporter. That wouldn't have occurred to me ever. And I really think you're doing tremendously important work. I want to thank you. I live in New York, so I'm in complete awe that there's an audience on a Friday night for a panel discussion on war reporting. So my respect to the audience. Thank you so much. There's a lot of other events going on that I will not be able to name right now because I haven't looked at the program. The last hour, Valentin can maybe do that. So thank you very much, Colette.
Thank you.
Thank you.